Welcome to Jesus and the Culture Conf, the YouTube channel where I look at our culture in a way that I hope Jesus would approve, or as you might have heard it called, the culture war. Do me a favor if you wouldn't mind. If you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe. And if you know somebody else who might like it, send the video their way. This helps with the YouTube algorithm so I can get more exposure. I got a lot of stuff coming down the pipeline, and your help would put a lot of wind in my sails. And in this video, I'm going to take a close look at H.P. Lovecraft. He's a horror writer from the early 20th century, and a very influential one. Lovecraftian is a term in literature, and most literature people will know what you mean when you say Lovecraftian. That's how influential he is. I've seen it in comics, and there are a lot of movies that are Lovecraftian. One made earlier this year is called Underwater. But I'm also going to take a close look at Leviathan. And Leviathan is the incarnation of chaos in the Old Testament. Now, believe it or not, H.P. Lovecraft and Leviathan are joined at the hip, as I will demonstrate. It's going to be fairly complicated, but if you stick with me, it's going to pay off. Paid off for me. One good thing about making videos is you're really forced to think about the topic, the subject that you're thinking about, and make sure you be more detailed oriented, and you always dig up more stuff. I'm always recrafting this text until the very instant I start filming them. Now, in the Enuma Elish, this is the creation epic of the city of Babylon, the counterpart to Leviathan is Tiamat. And Tiamat shows up in Genesis, but she's sublimated. I mean, she's not a goddess, she becomes more of a force of nature. She is the deep, the abyss. Now, the god Marduk defeats Tiamat thusly. The details are important. Details are important. She's got her mouth wide open, presumably to swallow him, and he blows a wind into that mouth. And now she can't shut her mouth, and her belly blows up and blows up and blows up, and he pops the belly like a balloon. And then, according to the text, he splits her in half like a flat fish, a clam, and he uses his body to create heaven above and earth below. So from that, what is the Babylonian idea about chaos? That it is something that needs to be crushed. Now, H.P. Lovecraft's world-famous Cthulhu, physically, looks more like Typhon. He doesn't exactly look like him, but he's more likened to Typhon. Now that's a Greek counterpart of both of those, Leviathan and Tiamat, and he fought Zeus. Okay? Thus, Cthulhu is H.P.'s counterpart to Leviathan. Cthulhu is Leviathan. You're going to get your fill of Cthulhu here. But the relationship between Yahweh and Leviathan is more nuanced, subtle, superior. The unformed is chaotic, but it is also pluripotent. Plura, like a pleroma or something, a fullness. It is a potency that can erupt into all sorts of fullness. Therefore, it is what? Full of what? Promise. There's the chaos of a boy becoming a man. There's the chaos I have to grapple with when I make a video, when I have to think very carefully about my subject. But what comes out of it? A video. Something comes out of it. At its best, chaos is potential. The word is important. I'm going to get to the linguistics of that word. At his worst, chaos is the unraveling of all things. He is both at the same time. At the latter end of that dialectic, the unraveling of all things, he is the exact counterpart to the Son of God. So when he is incarnate, and he will incarnate, he will be the Antichrist. Now, Satan is not a creator, he's a counterfeiter. So like God, Satan is a trinity. In Revelation chapters 12 and 13, he lays out the satanic trinity very nicely. In chapter 12, where we see the woman crowned with the 12 stars and clothed in the sun and the moon at her feet, the Virgin Mary. Right after that, we see the dragon expelled from heaven. That's Satan the Father. Then we have the sea beast, that's Leviathan. We meet him in chapter 41 of the book of Job. We're going to look at him here. Boy, it's going to be fascinating. It's complicated, but boy, it's going to be fascinating. I'm going to break it down for you. We meet him in chapter 41. He's Satan the Son, obviously the counterpart to the Son of God. And the land beast is Satan the unholy spirit. How do I know that? Well, among other things, he causes fire to come down from the sky. Remember, counterfeiter, when does fire come down from the sky in the book of Acts? Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit descends as tongues of flames. Now, as a Jungian devotee, I can amplify this interpretation by treating H.P.'s novella as a product of what Carl Jung would call active imagination. In this case, an alpha level version of it. This man is a master. There's a reason why the term Lovecraftian was named after him. So I can tell you that Cthulhu, just like Leviathan, just like chaos in general, he has a dialectical counterpart in H.P.'s unconscious, the great fish. C.G. Jung encountered him, and indeed this is his drawing of him from his renowned Red Book. I swam alongside the great fish in tropical ocean waters in one of my dreams years ago when I was in Jungian therapy. It was scary, but it was thrilling. I actually tried to follow him when he headed back down into the depths, but he just flicked his tail and off he went. He was out of touch almost instantly. Even better, I can treat this mythologically and even linguistically. Potential comes from the Indo-European root potnia, which means lady or wife. So potential is a lady, and Leviathan is an angry lady, or he was sent by an angry lady. The Greeks never made up their mind. It was either Gaia or Hera who sent him after Zeus. It's not a coincidence that Leviathan shows up in the book of Job. Now everybody is all up in arms about Job, but they need to keep in mind that Job is a type of Christ, a type of Jesus. A type is a representation, you could call it a non-verbal prophecy, a preview of what's to come with Jesus. God does not make us do anything that he's not going to do himself. Remember, Jesus was tortured to death after he was slandered and libeled. Job got off easy. H.P. Lovecraft, like all mortals, has no hope in a struggle against chaos. Remember, in his incarnation of the great fish, he swam alongside me because he wanted to, but when he was ready to go, flick of his tail, he was gone. So how am I supposed to fight something like that? In the incarnation as the Antichrist, only Jesus could defeat him. And so H.P. Lovecraft, as all of us, needs to accept Jesus. I hope he did before it was too late. Now, he says this himself, this overwhelming power of Cthulhu, of Leviathan. He says it far better than I could have. And better than most Christians, he really truly understands what the world is like without Jesus. And I stress this over and over again in my review of Ad Astra. Boy, don't underestimate how nasty things can get without Jesus. We're built to be gods, straddling both heaven and earth. We have a spiritual side and we have a physical side. None of the gods match us on that. And the angels, we're actually above them. We're supposed to be. But we're descended to the level of slaves, condemned to back-breaking labor in the fields and excruciating labor in childbirth and death. This is the opening paragraph for the Call of Cthulhu. It is fantastic. H.P. is crafting some of the finest writing I've ever read. It is rich in cognitive whiplash, irony, a pleroma, a fullness of irony. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. I mean, we got all the pieces, but do you really want to put them together? We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. Wow, okay. But someday, the piecing together dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Wow. Remember, you have to look to Jesus, the chaos of the waters. Peter looks around, he doesn't look at Jesus, he falls into the water. Jesus pulls him back up. Keep your eyes on Jesus. You will be fine. He promises that. Okay. So, let's put it all together. For the Babylonians, Tiamat, that is chaos, is a monster that needs to be crushed. How does the Bible treat Tiamat, Tiam, and Leviathan? Well, the Tiam is what the alchemists of the Middle Ages would call the prima materia, the prime material. Matter and material comes from mater, which is the Latin for mother, so it's the mother lode, if you will. The Tiam is an almost living pluripotent matrix, pleroma, fullness, pluripotent matrix, that is everything at once, and therefore it's nothing at all. In the beginning, the Spirit of God, the Ruach, the wind, remember, hovers over the face of Tiam, not like an enemy, but like a great cosmic bird hovering over its brood. And by his command of his word, let there be light. Let there be a firmament in the midst of the water, separating the water from the water. Let the water under the firmament gather together, and let the dry land appear, all the way up to the creation of man. Notice he lets. He doesn't jump in and do. This is almost a living creature that obeys his will. This is God's shoggoth, a Lovecraftian term. You'll find out what it is later. God is allowing that to unfold, which is already in vitro, in the Tiam, in the shoggoth. Now, there's another thing you need to understand. The gods are real. Zeus and Indra and Baal, they're real. The Old Testament calls them the Bnei Ha-Elohim, the sons of God. And mankind is divided up among the different sons of God after our rebellion at the Tower of Babel. Because we didn't just rebel in Eden, as you may know. Now, Moses assumes this in the so-called Song of Moses in Deuteronomy, which the rabbis rewrote. They wrote out the different gods. But it's obvious from looking at the New Testament text that our people were reading the original text, which sure enough was recovered by the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I'm going to read Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9, and 43 from the New American Standard Version. Hang on. When the Most High, that's Elion, God Most High, El is God, apportioned the nations when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods, the number of the sons of God, the Bnei Ha-Elohim. The Lord's own portion was his people. Yahweh's own portion was his people. Jacob his allotted share. Now we move down to 43. Praise, O heavens, his people. Worship him, all you gods. For he will avenge the blood of his children, and will take vengeance on his adversaries. He will repay those who hate him, and cleanse the land for his people. So Yahweh is one of the so-called sons of God, but he's actually very different, because he's actually an incarnation of God Most High himself. He's just LARPing as a thunder god. All of these new that emerge at this time of Jacob, all these new kings of the pantheon, the king gods, they're all thunder gods. And he's just LARPing as one of them. Now, when Yahweh is talking to Job about Leviathan, what is he manifesting as? Well, chapter 38 tells us he's answering Job from a whirlwind, so he's a thunder god. Indeed, in every instance but one, a very interesting one, the chief enemy of the monster, of Cthulhu, of Leviathan, of Tiamat, is a thunder god. We've already talked about Marduk and Zeus. Leviathan himself has two thunder gods for an enemy. He has Yahweh and he has Baal. Gee, what a coincidence. Baal and Yahweh are rivals in the Old Testament. I wonder what that's about. Baal is real, and he wanted to usurp the power of Yahweh, who he thought was just another little thunder god. Well, he learned that hard way, that that's not what happened. Now, the one exception is Apollo, but that's because the real enemy of this creature is whoever the chief god of the pantheon is. Now, the reason why the Greeks have two versions of the struggle with the serpent, Apollo fights Python, Zeus fights Typhon. They're very similar. There's a weird flip going around in Indo-European language, so they're actually the same deity, the same being. The reason why they have two versions of it, because Greek civilization didn't start on the mainland, it started on the island of Crete. And I'm pretty sure I've demonstrated on my main channel that the chief god of Crete, of the Minoans on Crete, was Apollo. Now, from here we can enter explicitly into Christianity. Who is Job talking to? Well, I already told you he's talking to Jesus. Zeus is one of the sons of God, but Jesus is the only true begotten son of God. And Jesus, as I said, is using Job to show us what he plans to allow us to do to him. Otherwise, we cannot be saved. He is doing these things to Job precisely because he is so innocent. And he proclaims throughout the book, I'm innocent. And you're thinking, well, maybe not. It's like, no, he was innocent. Once again, God does not expect us to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. Now, here's an interesting thing that I just quote. I'm going to re-quote this. H.P. writes, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of the black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. This is a 100% purebred Jungian definition of our own conscious ego, a little bitty island in the black sea of the unconscious, both personal and collective. Now, Cthulhu, Leviathan, the big fish, he's way out in the deep. They're way out in the great, great depth, in the depth of the collective unconscious. Unfortunately for HP, we cannot allow ourselves to be paralyzed by terror. And he kind of was, but I'm going to show you there's evidence that he was actually making some pretty good progress. He didn't live long, so I don't know if he made his way out. We cannot be paralyzed by terror. We must venture forth onto those dark, scary surfs. We must be careful for sure. We must be humble and we must be flexible. Absolutely. But we're wrong to be paralyzed. Now, as of the time he wrote at the Mountains of Madness, he was still paralyzed in a way. He's in a mountain. He's embedded in stone. There's stone everywhere, but there is, well, the Shoggoth are pluripotent. Okay, as opposed to Cthulhu, who is pure chaos. So there's an increase there. Also, are we land animals or are we sea animals? Well, we're land animals. So the mountains are over a big underground ocean. So there's the unconscious, and you have these Shoggoth coming up to the mountain, all right? Which is what? The unconscious is coming to meet him where he's more comfortable. And it's manifesting as pluripotency, as promise. So there's psychological progress between the time of Cthulhu and the time of At the Mountains of Madness. Now, finally, I was surprised to discover that HP is only an example of a whole stream of literary content, both here and in Britain, of creepy little horror stories. And it stretches all the way back to the man who's apparently its source, Edgar Allan Poe. So we're looking at a homegrown American phenomenon. And the quality of the work is quite often very high. Now, you can go ahead and read a spoiler dump on the major works of H.P. Lovecraft, but you really should read the man himself. Now, get ready for some work. I've had to break out the dictionary for the first time in decades reading this guy. Now, as I said, he was an atheist. He was sickly growing up, and both of his parents died in a mental institution. So he has a family history of family members being destroyed by their own unconscious. So that makes sense. He was heavily influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, obviously, and by his grandfather, who used to tell him scary little Victorian horror stories when he was a kid. And some of the imagery would make its way into the works of his grandson, H.P. Now, H.P. is well known to be a racist. Well, that's what people think. But that's because they're sloppy in what their definition of a racist is. That's done on purpose, by the way. They want you to have this unfocused fear. It's really just a racial slur against white people. People say the same thing about me for the same reason, because they're sloppy. It's clear to me, and I think this is a fair definition, that a racist is somebody who's not going to judge you by the content of your character just because of the color of your skin. Now, is that a fair definition? I would like to think so. There are passages where it seems obvious that he actually is racist, especially in the Call of Cthulhu. But I'm going to read a passage that will demonstrate to you that we're the opposite end of the universe from being racist. It's going to be fairly obvious if you really think about what this means. Now, I got this book here. This is a complete collection of Lovecraft's work. You can get everything of his online for free because the copyright's over. But I like books. I like things in my hand. That's what she said. But this is all of his work from the beginning towards the end. These are I've only read The Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness. As I said, I'm going to read a lot more than that. His writings went through 3 cycles. So anyway, you can get PDF online, so you can get all this stuff and you can read it. He went through three stages. We have his macabre stories, his dream cycle stories, and his Cthulhu Lovecraft mythos stories, which are his most famous. That's where the Lovecraftian comes from. Here I'm going to deal with his 2 most famous, The Call of Cthulhu, written in 1928, and At the Mountains of Madness, published almost exactly 8 years later in 1936. Again, he'd made a lot of psychological progress. These are the only 2 stories that I've read so far. I'm going to read them all eventually. And I'm going to get to Poe eventually as well, Edgar Allan, but I got a lot of irons in the fire, so it'll be a while to do that. I picked those 2 stories because originally this was going to be a review of the movie Underwater. And Underwater is a combination of those 2 stories. Now, the subtitle of this video was originally going to be The Original Alien, because everybody's trashing Leviathan for being an alien wannabe. But actually, Underwater is a legitimate tale of the Cthulhu mythos. HP would approve of it in its broad implementation, although a lot of things that are done in its specific implementation he'd have a lot of problems with. What throws people off, I will admit, is the movie's influenced by Alien, but that's not a problem. Nothing comes from nothing. Something always leads to a movie, and if it's important enough, something will follow out of the movie to lead to something else. Now, HP's dilemma is, I repeat, the dilemma I talk about in my review Ad Astra. A life without Jesus is a life of despair. Once again, H.P. gets it right where most Christians get it wrong. His elder gods and his odd little half-animal, half-vegetable creatures are in fact real. There's a video on YouTube by a guy who went to hell, and he saw a lot of demons who looked a lot like that. So it's not just angels and demons. The spiritual world is a lot more complicated than that, as you would expect. Things are always more complicated than you think. You know, it's kind of like evolution. Well, we had the multicellular organisms come from the simple organisms, and they were simple. It's like, no. They were never simple. We're looking at the new stuff, scans coming from living cells so that they're still alive. We can see them moving. It's just like they're alive. I've said it in several videos here and on my main channel. We're not alive because we have DNA. We have DNA because we're alive. It's just so strange. Jesus liberated us from those gods, just as Jesus was with God the Father when he ordered the prima materia to morph into the world, both visible and invisible. Now, before I proceed, there's a big old spoiler alert. The Call of Cthulhu is a pretty straightforward story, but at the Mountains of Madness, there's a big old, good Lord, plot twist, okay? You're strung along, you're going this way, and then boom, all of a sudden you have to turn on a dime. Pretty much the definition of a plot twist. It's about 60 pages long, so I would recommend reading the book before watching the rest of this video. I actually watched it twice because there's some foreshadowing there that you forget about by the time you get to the end, but that's pretty much true for anything. It is precisely the revelatory passage where we have the big plot twist that I'm going to read from, so that's why I have to read it. Now, having said that, we meet Cthulhu in the Call of Cthulhu. He's a creature imprisoned in the sea, the unconscious. In the story, it should be obvious by now that it is none other than Yahweh who releases him temporarily from his prison. It is Yahweh who sends a storm to a Christian ship to drive him to this visit with Cthulhu and his followers, and it is Yahweh who drives him back into his prison. You see how the unconscious works? The collective unconscious? Jung makes it clear that it's impersonal. We're not in control of this. I'm not in control of that fish. H.P. Lovecraft had no idea he was doing the Bible. At the Mountains of Madness, H.P. has folded Cthulhu's species, his whole species, into a larger universe. You know, like the Marvel Universe. Lovecraft was doing the Lovecraft universe back in the 1930s. The Cthulhu are aliens who, for lack of a better phrase, translated to Earth through different dimension, through space and time, and found that another group of aliens had already been here for millions of years, the old ones. The Cthulhu went to war with them and tended to get the better of them, until their island country sunk beneath the waves, and that's the story that we hear from the Call of Cthulhu. It emerges temporarily in that, and it will emerge for the final time at the end of times, the final battle. So I would interpret the Call of Cthulhu as a story of Yahweh giving us another preview, this time for Christendom. Although it is a horror story, it is nevertheless hopeful, because it demonstrates Yahweh's absolute command over the fate of Cthulhu. See? So you get the impression from reading the book, and I believe H.P. had that impression, that it is Cthulhu who summons the storm and the earthquake. It's like, no, his ancient enemy did. We also get a taste of Leviathan's nature in this book. Now, friends, and I've talked about this just a little bit ago, I'm going to talk about it again. You think the world is good, would be perfectly fine without Jesus? You are wrong. You cannot be more wrong. You need to take a clear-eyed look at the history of Islam. Don't go to the university scholars. Don't go to the mullahs, because the mullahs lie to you. And the scholars are terrified of them, so they'll fall in line. There's a lot of independent stuff going on, really good stuff. They hit the archaeology. They hit the Arabic on YouTube. These people are fantastic. Learn about the Golden Horde. Learn about the Mongols, how horrible they were. Rid yourself of these illusions of the noble American native, the Native Americans. 20% of them died violently. 20% of the men died violently. Anthropologists can tell from looking at their bones. Only 2% of white men died violently in World War II. No, I'm sorry, in World War I. In the middle of World War I, only 2% as opposed to 20. We're even head and shoulders above the Chinese. I know everybody said the Chinese are going to pass us out. The Chinese serfs were interchangeable cogs in a machine. You could replace one with the other. I was studying China for years. I was really into that. And the elites only really talk about themselves and among themselves. Oh, there is the will of heaven every time they have a revolution or something like that, or the weather. But if you were a serf in the Middle Ages, then you were in a family. And the Lord was expected to be the father of his family. Those two orientations produce completely different cultures. And that is specifically Christian. You don't see that in the Germans or the Romans or the Greeks before that. Which society would you rather live in? This isn't really hard, is it? The encounter with Cthulhu in this novella was disorienting because no rules were respected, just as no rules in the world are respected. The sky was different, the sun was different, something was concave, it was convex, was it on the ground, was it up and down? You couldn't tell. The character speaks of non-Euclidean geometry to convey how nonsensical it was, but non-Euclidean geometry is a real thing, and it makes perfect sense. There's only, all the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees on a flat surface. On a sphere, they're greater than 180, and on a convex surface, they're less. So what here is not, doesn't make any sense. Now, the overall story of Underwater is the Call of Cthulhu, but it is animated by the spirit of At the Mountains of Madness. Both stories have a crew of specialists, bearing with them a large infrastructure of up-to-date modern technology that you would think would keep them safe. In the cosmic game, we're not even in it. We're not even in the cosmic game. Not even close. Also, when you read it, you will instantly think, when you read At the Mountains of Madness, you'll instantly think of The Thing, the 1982 version. The main abomination in both is a mimic. Sled dogs play a big role in both. Underwater literally has Cthulhu. He is there. As in the Call of Cthulhu and in Underwater, he is temporarily at least defeated by the protagonist, one of the characters. But the characters in the movie have to fight off multiple abominations, which we have at the Mountains of Madness, except they're sub-abominations. They're completely different species. They're much bigger than us, but they're dwarfed into insignificance by Cthulhu. The chaos creatures still exist in At the Mountains of Madness, but as a host species, as I said, the Shoggoth, and here they are, they represent the inherent pluripotent nature of chaos. That is why I call the cosmos Yahweh's Shoggoth. As I said, they're moving from the absolute chaos into the promise. He's made psychological progress. He's on his home turf. They've come up to meet him. He's still horrified by them, but they've come up to meet him. They make the sound tequili-li, because they're mimicking the old ones who had created him and whom they had exterminated. You see, HP sets you up. Because at the very end, you think the old ones are evil incarnate. They do some pretty awful things to half his crew. And he does an awful lot of foreshadowing to tell you that. But suddenly, everything makes sense. Plot twist. Here's my passage, the one I was telling you about. Now, if HP and I would say something like this about something that originally we thought was a vegetable or something like a starfish, then do you really think something trivial like your skin color is going to get in the way of us wanting to evaluate you carefully? That we're just going to want to blow you off because of your skin color? Now, mind you, the old ones had slaughtered everyone at their western camp. Killed the dogs, too. Here's the quote. When he has this revelation. They had not even been savages. For what indeed had they done? That awful awakening in the cold of an unknown epoch? Because they'd been out for millions of years in hibernation, running away from the Shoggoth. Perhaps an attack by the furry, frantically barking quadrupeds, the dogs, in a dazed defense against them because they're just waking up, and the equally frantic white simians, the humans, with the queer wrappings and paraphernalia, poor Lake, poor Gedfrey, and poor old ones, scientists to the last. What had they done that we would not have done in their place? God, what intelligence and persistence. What a facing of the incredible, just as those carven kinsmen and forebears had faced things only a little less incredible. Radiates, vegetables, monstrosities, star spawn, whatever they had been, they were men. You must read H.P. Lovecraft. You can't settle on reading about him. His work, but it's so rewarding. So if At the Mountains of Madness is anything, it is a grim, despairing tragedy. Their species was extinct and they didn't know it. The humans were their only hope for survival, but because both species fatally misread each other, the lone bridge was now burned. And in the end, they would return frantically home to discover if their people had survived their Holocaust, only to be the last of their kind slaughtered by the Shoggoth. The Shoggoth. The Shoggoth is a thing that cannot make up its own mind. It cannot settle onto anything, so it settles onto nothing. Thus, after exterminating a noble species that has lived on Earth for more than 1 billion years, they now just roam aimlessly in the caverns carved throughout the mountains of madness, while the ruins of a massive, extinct civilization crumble around them. Excuse me, dry throat. We are the kings and queens of God's Shoggoth, and we also rebelled against God when we thought he was mean, just like the Shoggoths in the novella rebelled against the old ones. But things will be very different with God's Shoggoth. He will be abolished and will be replaced with a new one. And those of us who are redeemed will finally rule it as gods, firmly embedded in our family, headed in turn by our Lord and our Father and our God, as it should have been. There's one more twist. The Thing is not based on At the Mountains of Madness. It's actually based on a novella called Who Goes There by John W. Campbell Jr. Now, I read it when I was in elementary school back in the late 1970s, and I remember that weekend reading it. It really kind of creeped me out. I love it. It's clearly influenced by the Mountains of Madness. It came out about 2 years later. Even the weather is unnatural when they find the aliens and whatever. Now, although as a novel with character, Who Goes There is actually a little better. Now, for grand vision and for command of the language, and obviously for originality, it goes to H.P. Lovecraft. But it's actually a little better as far as the nuts and bolts of putting a novel together. Campbell corrects a major logistical flaw with At the Mountains of Madness. I mean, he has a mountain range that dwarfs the Himalayas. I mean, tallest peak in the world is the Everest? No. That would be like maybe not even the top 10. And there's another one that's even bigger that runs parallel to that about 300 miles away. I mean, there's no way. And although the city of the old ones is trivial compared to those mountains, it still dwarfs Manhattan. It has stone buildings that are still formidable despite millions of years of getting worn down by these brutal Antarctic winters. Now, all of this could not have been missed, but one little spaceship that crash lands in a mountain range more than 20 million years ago, it's now embedded in rock-solid ice, and the only way we can pick it up is by its magnetic signature, and even then, when you're nearby, that's doable. If you have a son in 5th or 6th grade, let him read this book. He'll love it forever. I know I did. Now, one final thing. One more Jungian thing. C.G. Jung, as you may know, is famous for bringing the world the idea of projection when we cast our shade onto other people and things. It's not necessarily just negative, though. We projected big time, we in the West. We projected onto both poles of the globe, the North Pole and the South Pole, in the 18th century going up to the early 20th century. So in the future, thinking about The Thing, but in the past, when I was reading At the Mountains of Madness, I also thought about Frankenstein, which I reviewed earlier, specifically Captain Robert Walton. Walton dreams of fabulous undiscovered lands in the Arctic, where the sun never shines. Beautiful projections, because there are also projections that are golden. All the warm, wonderful things in us that we don't know we have, that gets projected too. It tells you a lot about his character. H.P. likewise projects onto the Antarctic, but as we've shown you, he projects horrors. Biologically engineered Shoggoths, ghosts of the old ones. And as well, in Frankenstein, Captain Walton finds Victor chasing after his own creature through lands that he had thought were blessed. So, these two great works are telling us something that we already know. Haunted minds will always find their ghosts. But there's hope. There's light in that darkness. Those ghosts are there for a reason. And it's worth it to go through the trouble to find out that reason. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was fun, and I hope it was helpful. God bless.